After Gundam Victory, the original architect for Universal Century and Gundam's main storyline creator, Mr. Yoshiyuki Kilemul Tomino, had disowned Gundam. He was tired of all the executive meddling around the shows and everything involving its toys. Or so the story says. Maybe it was different, but it doesn't matter since for the turn of the millennium, Tomino was back with another Gundam series, the brilliantly weird Turn A Gundam. This new show was set on a new chronology called Correct Century, which is later than late Universal Century, or not, which happens after Regular Century, or not, which is the canonical end of every alternate Gundam chronology, or not. Yeah, Gundam has a very weird concept of canon and chronology. In fact, we can even extend this and say that Eastern fiction has a very different concept of canon and chronology than us from the West. And for the most part, that's good. I really like how Universal Century has evolved over its 40 years of existence and now has like 10 or more Gundams appearing only in the 1 year wartime period, let alone all of the others that have appeared over the years in manga cycles. And again, for me, that's great. The more stories set in Universal Century, the better. But after a while, a certain question starts to pop up in the minds of every Western Gundam fan, and it goes something like this. What is the Gundam's main canonical chronology? And ask that question to 10 different people, and you'll definitely get 10 different answers. In fact, I won't even try to answer it per se. Well, not really. I'll obviously try to explain something about it since it keeps popping up, and for me, coming from the Grant Morrison school of thought that everything is canon to a certain extent, it's actually not that hard. We can more or less separate all of the 40 years of Gundam media in 4 categories. Tomino's Universal Century, Sunrise Universal Century, Peripheral Universal Century, and Not Universal Century. The latter is the easiest to understand as it encompasses the vast majority of newer works. If it's directly stated that said series is not part of Universal Century, then don't worry. Everything that you need to know will be explained starting from episode 1 and or manga number 1. After Colony, Anno Domini, Cosmic Era, Post-Disaster, Ad Stella, etc., all of them are not Universal Century. Simple. But you may be thinking, yo, Absa, what happens with regular and correct centuries? And those are Tomino's Universal Century, a Universal Century-ish timeline that caters all of his Gundam stories, even Gaia Gear. So yeah, strictly speaking, regular and correct centuries are not Universal Century, but actually they lean heavily towards Tomino's Universal Century. And that leaves us with Sunrise Universal Century, which includes every animated piece of Gundam media that pertains to Universal Century, with a heavy emphasis on what was animated, which brings us to Peripheral Universal Century, a Universal Century bubble that encompasses all of the manga and novel interpretations, reinterpretations, and expansions of Universal Century. The whole Crossbone Saga, the Unicorn novels, G. Savior, etc., all of them are Peripheral Universal Century. And if you're paying attention, by this point you may have realized that I have not answered the question, what is the Gundam canonical chronology, in a true sense. And you see, a lot of people get offended with canon disparities or even retcons. It's an ongoing Western battle with overall fiction. But why is that? So my friends, I'm Absa, and it's time now to explore where did our obsession with the canon started, how it's different from Eastern thinking, and why, when talking about a franchise that spans decades and has various storytellers, it's better if the canon stays flexible. And yes, since I'm on camera again, this is going to be a very weird video, not so long, but very weird. The English word canon comes from the Greek kanon, meaning rule or measuring stick. Put a pin to the word rule. The current use of the term canon to refer to a collection of scripture books was introduced by the Dutch scholar David Runken in 1768 in his Historia Critica Oratorum Graecorum for lists of Greek and Roman sacred scriptures. After that, the term was borrowed by the Judeo-Christian religious communities to differentiate between true manuscripts and apocryphal ones. What makes up the biblical canon, or one manuscript true and the other apocryphal, is absolutely out of the scope of this video, but the point of sharing this origin of the word canon is to notice that its widespread use was thanks in part to Western scholars in an effort to enlighten the true from the false. So, leaving out the religious overtones, canon is a rule which measures truthness. Yes, it's a real word, I searched for it in the dictionary. In essence, canonical means truth, non-canonical means false. Anyway, another thing that comes to mind when talking about canon is continuity, which more or less can be simplified as something that continues on from point A to point B. But this introduces the concept of discontinuity, which may also be known as continuity error. And if you're familiar with old films or that episode of Game of Thrones where Daenerys was drinking a Starbucks coffee, then you know that a continuity error is a minor or major incident of something that happens in story that can ruin the illusion of realism and affect the suspension of disbelief. Also, note how something that is discontinuous is perceived as an error. With that said, now we have two concepts that work together: canon and continuity. Moving on, in literature, the term canon was first used to distinguish between the original works of a writer who created certain characters and or settings, and the later works of other writers who took up the same characters or settings. The most used example is the canon of Sherlock Holmes, that consists of 56 short stories and 4 novels written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and all of the other subsequent works by other authors who also use the character Sherlock Holmes are considered non-canonical. Lastly, comics, particularly DC and Marvel, use the term canon for their main universe, with DC having Earth Prime and Marvel having Earth 616, for the most part. Everything that happens there is canonical, like when Superman was killed or when Doc Ock became the superior Spider-Man. And since everything else that happens in another world is non-canonical, this differentiation allows for super interesting or super weird stories that do not abide to the current storyline or even the same origin, like Superman Red Son, Batman White Knight, or even weirder stuff like Marvel Zombies and Deadpool Kills the Marvel Universe. Having said that, we can now more or less picture why the concept of canon or canonicity in Western thought is that prevalent. First and foremost, as people from the West, we have a predominantly Judeo-Christian school of thought. Maybe not you, definitely not me, but yeah, it is what it is. This means that from a very early age, we are introduced to the concept of canon with the Holy Scriptures of, insert here the Judeo-Christian branch of the area where we were born. Something like that. Then add to that the concept of discontinuity being synonym of error in continuity, and finally, and maybe to a lesser extent if you're not from America, the 80 or more years of connected superhero stories happening in the same universe. So yeah, here in the West, canonicity is very big and very prevalent. It allows us to discern the truth from the apocrypha. Very bigger quotes. Oh, and yeah, before I forget, another concept to have in mind is if the fiction is official or not. For example, Batman appearing on Fortnite, it's official, but it's not canon. In essence, if it's canon, it's definitely official. But if it's official, it's not necessarily canon. And by now, you may be wondering if I'm ever going to talk about Gundam. And don't worry, I assure you that I'm getting there. In fact, I'll proceed to talk loosely about Eastern thinking and fiction that I believe that qualifies as something with a not so tight canon. Okay, so now I'm entering controversial territory again, as I'm not qualified to talk about religion, much less Eastern religious thoughts. What I can safely say is that be it Buddhism, Shintoism, or even Confucianism, those ways of thought are much more lenient towards what is the truth, or however you want to call it. For example, there is no one true Buddhism, just different ways to perceive the truth according to your way of living. With that said, there is no equivalent of religious canon, at least not in the same level of the Judeo-Christian thought. In the East, there's only a more prevalent way of thinking or more predominant gods and or rituals of certain areas. But nothing quite as strict as here in the West. Anyway, let's move away from religion and more towards fiction. If here in the West we have Marvel and DC's continuity-heavy universes, the only Japanese equivalent that I could think of was the ongoing tokusatsu shows like Ultraman, Kamen Rider, and Super Sentai. Those types of shows have been ongoing for more than 5 decades, yet they are not as tightly connected as their Western superhero counterparts. Or such is my perception, since I'm not really a fan of tokusatsu shows, nor I don't know much about it. As for the manga and or anime, well, here's where the main differences appear. Generally speaking, there's only one author for every manga, period. If it's successful enough, maybe they get an editor or even an anime team, but the author has more or less full control of its creation, with nobody else but them deciding the main storyline's direction. Now, if the manga is super successful, then it may get an anime fillers, anime films, and even manga spin-offs. Dragon Ball is a great example where the work of Akira Toriyama got many expansions with the movies, the filler episodes, and even some interesting spin-offs like Dragon Ball Heroes. Saint Seiya is another Japanese work that has a lot of spin-offs, with some of them expanding the original story and others directly contradicting it. Yet Masami Kurumada has the final say as for what is canon and what is not. So again, the original author decides over the franchise. But what happens with Gundam, where the original author, Yoshiyuki Tomino, is not really the owner of the rights? Well, remember the 4 categories that I talked about previously? It's as simple or as hard as that. It really depends on your imagination and how good your knowledge of geometry is. Let me explain. Since the very beginning of Gundam, there has been differences between what was portrayed in the anime versus Tomino's novelizations of his stories. The prime example being that Amuro Ray from the novel was always a soldier instead of a civilian turned soldier. And more importantly, he dies in the final attack against Sion in Aobaoaku. So yeah, I may have a gripe for Zeta, a new translation's ending, but man, Tomino has been changing everything since the very inception of Gundam. Now, and here's where I'll try to bring everything together. Gundam is one of the few Japanese intellectual properties that have the concept of a multiversal franchise similar to the ones we have here with the IPs of the West. From superheroes to Transformers to Star Wars and Star Trek to everything else. But the main difference is that the concept of canon is really not that influenced by religious interpretation or even literature studies. That means that it doesn't burden that much in Eastern authors, since they don't really have a super dogmatic religious background nor a super strict perception of discontinuity equals error. At least that's my theory as to why the concept of canon is super different in Japanese fiction. Having said that, Gundam's canon fits perfectly in a fractured but continuous timeline of ever-mutating bubble events. The one-year war events are ever-changing, with new things being added by new authors but kept in the same one-year war bubble so that it doesn't affect the start of Zeta. This means that the original bubble of Tomino's Mobile Suit Gundam is still there. It just got super big with new authors literally breathing new air into that time period. The connection to the Zeta bubble is still the same. It's just that the one-year war event bubble is getting super big as time passes and the Zeta event bubble not so much. That's why the Unicorn bubble event could fit perfectly in between Char's counterattack and Hathaway's flash, since those two events are connected in a much more looser way than, say, Zeta and Double Zeta. By framing the UC as a fractured but continuous timeline of ever-mutating bubble events, anything can happen and everything fits annexed or just nearby to the big moments. And if you squint, the timeline looks like a perfect continuum. Canon is used more like a guide and not like a rule, which gives the newer stories much more room to operate, and that makes them so much better. Oh yeah, and the alternate timelines are precisely that, alternate timelines that are perfectly parallel to the UC. And in some cases, like regular century or correct century, just like in certain scenarios in math where parallel lines meet at infinity, regular century and correct century converge and meet at infinity, which in our case, the great infinity, is Mr. Yoshiyuki Kilemol Tomino. And yes, somehow I ended up talking about religion and math in a Gundam video, and I'm not even sorry. But this means that this exploration has been going on for too much time now. Gundam Canon. What a topic, right? Truth of the matter is that I find it fascinating how some people break their heads and try to list everything that happens in the UC in a chronological order when not even Tomino bothered to do it. And I'm not saying that to shame those persons. On the contrary, that's quite a formidable task you're doing. For the most part, I really don't care if something contradicts something else if it adds something else to the overall story. Even in real life, we have certain cases of reality being different according to where you live or on what side of the story you were. So yeah, I don't really know where all the fuss about Gundam's canon originates, nor why Twitter explodes when the new Thunderbolt chapter appears and we see Io, or Io, I don't know how it's pronounced, piloting the transforming Neo-Turn Unicorn Gundam against the CCN Psycho Phoenix. No, not really, just kidding. Thunderbolt is actually super weird and I love it for it. But yeah, all in all, I really prefer for long franchises to use canon as a guide instead of a rule, so that they may still change things from before to give more weight to newer stories. Or said in another way, to retcon stories from before. But hey, that's my way of interpreting fictional timelines, and I'm definitely super curious as to how you like to understand Gundam's canon, so please leave it in the comments. And if you're wondering why I decided to tackle this subject instead of something else, well, as I was researching for that Turn A video, I came across a lot of debate regarding its position in the overall Gundam timeline, with even Tomino not really knowing exactly if it happens before Jireko or after. So I decided to take my jab at attempting to explain where canon came from and why is it considered so important here in the West, but not so in the East, especially in works where the franchise transcended its original creator and have been going on for almost half a century. In essence, my thoughts are that a rigid structure is prone to break with the passing of time, whereas a flexible structure will definitely endure the punches of time. But again, let me know in the comments what are your thoughts on canon. And as you may or may not know, my name is Absa and we can continue the conversation over at Twitter, where you can follow me at Absalonicus, and on Instagram, where I post pictures of my figures, my cats, and sometimes even myself. I'll be trying to talk more about anime, comics, and mechanical design, but via model kits. Until next time, always remember that in fiction lies power, so let's use it to forge a new type of story, our hero's journey.